On the morning of October 19th, 1092 of the Common Era, in the courtyard of a mosque in the city of Isfahan, a man dressed as a Sufi mystic approached the vizier Nizam al-Mulk and drove a blade into his chest. The assassin made no attempt to flee, and the vizier, architect of the Seljuk Empire's governance for 30 years, died within moments. The killing was not an act of madness or spontaneous rage. It was the first successful operation of a new kind of organization, one that would reshape the politics of the medieval Islamic world and terrify Crusader kings, Sunni caliphs, and eventually the Mongol Khans themselves. The man who ordered the assassination ruled from a fortress so remote that armies struggled to reach it, and his followers became known by a name that would echo through centuries: Hashashin. In European languages, the word evolved into assassin, a term now applied to any professional killer, but the original Hashashin were not mercenaries. They were believers. This is the story of what it truly meant to be a medieval assassin, not the mythology of drugged killers or mystical obedience, but the lived reality of men who learned languages, studied theology, infiltrated enemy courts, and died in public squares to send a message their masters could never deliver with armies. It is the history of the Nizari Ismailis state, a breakaway Islamic sect that survived for nearly 2 centuries using murder as statecraft, operating from mountain fortresses across Persia and Syria between 1088 and 1256 of the Common Era. It is also the broader story of how assassination functioned across the medieval world, from the courts of Christendom to the dynastic struggles of China, and how fear itself became a weapon as potent as the blade. The man who ordered Nizam al-Mulk's death was named Hassan I Sabah, and he had spent years preparing for that moment. Born in the city of Qom in Persia, sometime around 1050 of the Common Era, Hassan was a scholar, not a soldier. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and Islamic law in the intellectual circles of Isfahan, then one of the great cities of the medieval world. But Hassan was also an Ismaili, a member of a minority Shia sect that believed the rightful leadership of Islam had passed through a hidden line of imams descended from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima. This was not merely a theological preference, it was a political identity that marked him as a heretic in the eyes of the Sunni Seljuk Turks, who ruled Persia with increasing brutality. In 1078, Hassan travelled to Cairo, the seat of the Fatimid Caliphate, the only major Islamic state governed by Ismaili doctrine. He spent 3 years there, deepening his theological training and his commitment to the Ismaili cause. But when he returned to Persia, he found his community under siege. The Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, a brilliant administrator and a devout Sunni, had launched a campaign to suppress Ismaili teaching, closing schools, exiling preachers, and encouraging local authorities to root out what he considered dangerous heresy. Hassan was forced into exile, moving from city to city, preaching in secret, building a network of followers who shared his vision of resistance. By 1086, Hassan understood that his community could not survive through theological argument or peaceful conversion alone. They needed a stronghold, a place beyond the reach of Seljuk armies, where they could govern themselves and strike back at their persecutors. He found it in the Alborz mountains of northern Persia, a fortress called Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, perched on a narrow ridge surrounded by peaks and accessible only by a single treacherous path. The fortress was already occupied, controlled by a local Zaydi ruler loyal to the Seljuks. Hassan did not assault it. Instead, he sent missionaries into the surrounding villages, converting farmers and craftsmen to the Ismaili cause. Slowly, carefully, he built support among the garrison itself. In 1088, the Lord of Alamut woke to find his own men had turned against him. Hassan I Sabah purchased the fortress for 3,000 gold dinars and took possession without bloodshed. It was a remarkably restrained beginning for a movement that would become synonymous with murder. From Alamut, Hassan began to build a state. He expanded the fortress, carving cisterns into the rock to store water, constructing granaries and libraries, and terracing the surrounding slopes for agriculture. He seized or converted other fortresses across northern Persia, creating a network of strongholds linked by messengers and loyal governors. But Hassan also understood that fortresses alone could not protect his people or expand his influence. The Seljuk Empire controlled the cities, the trade routes, and the armies. Hassan could not meet them on the battlefield, so he chose a different strategy: eliminate the men who made the Seljuk state function. Viziers, generals, judges, tax collectors, anyone whose skills or authority upheld Sunni dominance became a potential target. And because his operatives could not survive open combat, Hassan trained them to kill in secret, to wait months or years for the perfect moment, and to die without revealing their orders or their network. The men who carried out these missions were called fedayeen, those who sacrificed themselves. They were recruited young, often from rural Ismaili families, and brought to Alamut or one of the other fortresses for training. They studied languages, learning Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, so they could pass as natives in different regions. They memorized the prayers and rituals of Sunni Islam, so they could blend into mosques and courts without suspicion. They trained with daggers, the preferred weapon because it could be concealed and used in close quarters, and because it forced the killer to confront his target face to face, a deliberate test of faith and nerve. They also studied the biographies and routines of potential targets, learning where a vizier prayed, which servants he trusted, and when his guards were distracted. Some operatives spent years posing as merchants, scribes, or servants, building cover identities so deep that even their closest associates did not suspect them. The goal was not simply to kill, but to demonstrate that no position, no bodyguard, and no palace wall could guarantee safety. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk proved the concept. The vizier was not a random target. He was the architect of Seljuk power, the man who had centralized the empire's administration, reformed its tax system, and funded the madrasas that spread Sunni orthodoxy across Persia. His death sent a message to every other Seljuk official: your policies have consequences, and we can reach you. Within a few years, Hassan's operatives had killed judges, governors, and military commanders across Persia. Each killing was public, theatrical, designed to maximize terror and demonstrate the futility of resistance. A dagger left on a pillow, a warning delivered by a stranger who vanished before guards could react, a respected scholar stabbed in a crowded market, while onlookers watched in stunned silence. The Hashashin did not act from bloodlust or nihilism. They believed they were carrying out God's will, purging the world of tyrants and hypocrites who oppressed the faithful. The promise of paradise awaited those who died in the attempt, and martyrdom was not feared but embraced. Yet this certainty came at a cost. To live as a fedayeen meant inhabiting a double life, smiling at men you intended to kill, attending their feasts, laughing at their jokes, all while preparing for the moment when you would drive a blade into their chest and accept your own death in return. It required a kind of psychological compartmentalization that few could sustain, and those who succeeded were shaped by it in ways the historical record can only hint at. Hassan I-Saba ruled Alamut until his death in 1124, rarely leaving the fortress, governing through letters and trusted deputies. His successors continued the strategy, expanding operations into Syria, where a network of Hashashin fortresses emerged under leaders like Rashid al-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain. The Nizari Ismailis became a third force in the politics of the Crusades, occasionally allying with Christian kingdoms against common Sunni enemies, occasionally targeting Crusader leaders like Conrad of Montferrat, who was stabbed to death by two Hashashin disguised as Christian monks on April 28, 1192. The reputation of the Hashashin grew not only through their actions but through the stories told about them, tales that blurred into legend even during their own time. But assassination was not unique to the Hashashin. Across medieval Europe, political murder functioned as a tool of statecraft, rebellion, and dynastic ambition, though it operated under different rules and carried different moral weight. In China, the act of killing a tyrant had philosophical sanction, debated by Confucian scholars and immortalized in histories that celebrated righteous regicide. The Hashashin were exceptional not because they invented political murder, but because they systematized it, made it the foundation of a state, and wielded it with a discipline that terrified their enemies and fascinated their chroniclers. The fortresses of Alamut stand in ruins now, destroyed by the Mongols in 1256. the library that Hashashin built, filled with texts on theology, astronomy, and the inner workings of the Ismaili faith, was burned, and with it went much of the primary evidence that might have revealed how the Hashashin truly saw themselves. What remains are the accounts of their enemies, the myths spun by Crusader chroniclers and travellers like Marco Polo, and the faint traces of a community that survived in diaspora, scattered across the mountains and cities of the Islamic world. The word assassin endures, stripped of its theological context, reduced to a synonym for hired killer. But the men who carried daggers into mosques and palaces were not mercenaries. They were believers in a cause they thought worth dying for, and the history of what they believed, how they lived, and why they killed is stranger and more human than the mythology that followed. The story begins not with a blade, but with a schism, a succession dispute in the Fatimid Caliphate that split the Ismaili community and set in motion the events that would lead a scholar named Nizari Ismailis to a fortress in the mountains, and from there to a strategy that would reshape the medieval world. Islam split 3 times before it fractured into the movement that would produce the Hashashin. Each rupture was a question of succession, theology and power, and each left communities smaller, more isolated, and more certain of their righteousness. By the time Nizari Ismailis took control of Alamat in 1088 of the Common Era, the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam had already endured centuries of persecution, internal debate and exile. What made the Nizari Ismailis different was not the depth of their faith, but their willingness to accept that survival in a hostile world required strategies their enemies considered unthinkable. The first split came in 632, within months of the Prophet Muhammad's death. The question was simple and unsolvable. Who leads the community of believers when the Prophet is gone? Most Muslims accepted the election of Abu Bakr, the Prophet's companion, as the first caliph. A minority insisted that leadership belonged to Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, whose authority they believed had been divinely ordained. This minority became known as the Shia, the party of Ali. The Sunni majority, which came to dominate the Islamic world, regarded the caliphate as a matter of communal consensus and political pragmatism. The Shia saw it as a sacred lineage, passed down through blood and divine will. Ali eventually ruled as the 4th caliph, but his assassination in 661 and the subsequent martyrdom of his son Hussein at Karbala in 680 turned theological disagreement into a wound that never healed. Within Shia Islam, further divisions emerged over which of Ali's descendants held legitimate authority. The Ismailis broke from the broader Shia community in the 8th century over the question of succession after the 6th Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. When Jafar died in 765, most Shia recognized his younger son Musa al-Qadim as the 7th Imam. A minority followed his elder son Ismail, who had predeceased his father but whose own son, they argued, inherited the imamati. These followers became the Ismailis, and their theology diverged in crucial ways from the majority. They believed in a living present imam whose authority was absolute, a figure who interpreted religious law and possessed esoteric knowledge unavailable to ordinary believers. The imam was not merely a political leader, but a manifestation of divine guidance on earth, and loyalty to him was inseparable from faith itself. By the 10th century, the Ismailis had built a state, the Fatimid Caliphate, founded in 909, and eventually centered in Cairo, ruled North Africa, Egypt, and parts of the Levant. The Fatimids were Ismaili Shia, and for a time they offered a rival center of power to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. But the Fatimids weakened. Internal factions formed. The military could not hold distant territories, and in 1094 the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir died, triggering a succession crisis that split the Ismailis once again. Al-Mustansir had designated his elder son Nizar as his successor, but the vizier who controlled the court and the military preferred the younger son, Al-Mustali, who was more pliable and less likely to challenge existing arrangements. The vizier installed Al-Mustali as caliph, and Nizar fled, raised a rebellion, and was eventually captured and executed. Most Ismailis in Egypt and the Western Territories accepted al-Mustali, but communities in Persia, already distant from Cairo, and under increasing pressure from Sunni authorities, rejected the coup. They remained loyal to Nizar, or rather to the principle he represented, that the imamate could not be usurped by political convenience. These communities became the Nizari Ismailis, and they found themselves without a state, without an imam present to guide them, and surrounded by enemies. The enemies were formidable: the Seljuk Turks, a dynasty of Sunni warriors who had migrated from Central Asia, had taken control of Persia and much of the Eastern Islamic world by the mid-11th century. The Seljuks ruled through military power and religious orthodoxy, and they were supported by a bureaucratic and theological apparatus that viewed Shia Islam, and especially Ismaili thought, as heresy. The Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who governed the empire for 30 years under 2 sultans, was particularly effective in consolidating Sunni dominance. He founded madrasas, religious schools that trained scholars and judges in orthodox Sunni law. He appointed governors who enforced conformity. He used the rhetoric of religious unity to justify the suppression of dissent. For the Nizari Ismailis living in cities like Isfahan, Qom, and Ray, this meant persecution. Open worship was dangerous. Expressing loyalty to the Nizari cause could result in imprisonment, execution, or the seizure of property. Entire communities lived in a state of enforced secrecy, outwardly conforming to Sunni practice while maintaining private allegiance to their imam and their interpretation of the faith. This practice had a name in Islamic theology: taqiyya, sacred dissimulation. It was not cowardice but a recognized survival strategy for minorities under threat. The principle held that outward conformity to the dominant faith was permissible, even required when the alternative was the destruction of the community. What mattered was inner belief, kept pure and transmitted in private from teacher to student, parent to child, trusted believer to trusted believer. Hassan Sabah understood this world intimately. He was born around 1050 in the city of Qom, in Persia, into a family that may have been Twelver Shia, the majority branch, or possibly already Ismaili. He studied in Ray and Isfahan, centers of learning where scholars debated theology, philosophy, and law in the confident atmosphere of Seljuk patronage. Hassan was brilliant, widely read, and argumentative. He became an Ismaili missionary, a dai, tasked with spreading the faith through teaching and conversion rather than force. In 1078, he traveled to Cairo, the Fatimid capital, seeking deeper knowledge and hoping to secure support for the struggling Ismaili communities of Persia. He spent 3 years there, immersed in Ismaili doctrine, before political intrigue and suspicion forced him to leave. By the time he returned to Persia in 1081, he was convinced of 2 things: the Nizari cause was righteous, and the traditional methods of resistance, scholarship, preaching, and appeals to authority would not be enough. Hassan spent the next 7 years traveling through Persia, preaching in secret, building networks of believers, and studying the political landscape. He observed how the Seljuks controlled cities, but struggled to project power into mountainous and remote regions. He watched how governors and military commanders relied on informants and loyal populations, and how fragile that loyalty could be when confronted with disciplined opposition. He studied fortresses, noting which were poorly garrisoned, which commanded strategic routes, and which could be taken not by siege but by conversion of the garrison from within. He was not planning a popular uprising or a conventional war. He was planning something more surgical and more patient. By 1087, Hassan had identified a target, the fortress of Alamut, perched in the Alborz Mountains north of Qazvin. It was remote, defensible, and held by a local lord with tenuous ties to the Seljuk state. Hassan sent missionaries into the surrounding villages, converting peasants and craftsmen. He sent agents into the fortress itself, offering friendship, engaging in theological debate, and slowly winning over members of the garrison. When Hassan finally arrived at Alamut in 1088, he did not bring an army. He simply walked in, presented the commander with a signed deed transferring ownership, and offered him compensation for his departure. The commander, realizing that most of his men had already converted and that resistance was futile, accepted the money and left. Hassan Sabah took possession of Alamut without a single casualty. From that fortress, over the next 3 decades, Hassan built a movement that would challenge empires. He transformed Alamut into a center of learning, governance, and military planning. He fortified it and acquired other castles through similar methods. He trained operatives who could move undetected through enemy cities, speak the language of scholars and soldiers, and strike at carefully chosen targets. And in 1092, 4 years after taking Alamut, he sent one of those operatives to Isfahan, where the man dressed as a Sufi mystic approached Nizam al-Mulk in the courtyard of a mosque and drove a blade into the vizier's chest. The assassination announced to the Seljuk Empire and the Sunni world that the Nizari Ismailis were no longer a sect to be suppressed in silence. They were a force that could reach anyone, anywhere, and they would not be ignored. With Hassan I Sabbah's ideology forged in exile and persecution, the question became not whether to resist, but how. In a world dominated by vast armies and urban centers controlled by hostile powers, he turned to a strategy that required neither the fortress, the network, and the knife. The fortress of Alamut stood on a narrow ridge in the Alborz Mountains, south of the Caspian Sea, roughly 100 miles from the city of Kazvin. The name meant eagle's nest in the local dialect, and the site earned it. Sheer cliffs dropped away on 3 sides. A single approach wound up from the valley below, exposed and easily watched. The ridge itself rose more than 6,000 feet above sea level, high enough that winter snows sealed it off for months at a time. From the ramparts, a sentry could see for miles across the valleys of Rudbar and Daylam, a landscape of narrow gorges, scattered villages, and peaks that turned violet at dusk. It was not the kind of place an army could take quickly, and Hassan I Sabbah knew it. He arrived in the region in 1084 of the Common Era, not as a conqueror, but as a missionary. Hassan had spent years traveling through Persia, preaching the Nizari cause in secret, gathering followers in towns where the Seljuk authorities were weak or distracted. The Alborz range offered something the cities could not: distance from Seljuk power and terrain that favored the defender. Alamut had been held for decades by a local Zaydi Shia lord named Mahdi, who ruled a modest domain from the fortress and taxed the villages below. Hassan did not storm the gates. He sent agents into the valley, men who spoke the local tongue and preached carefully. Some of the villagers converted. So did a few of the garrison soldiers. By 1088, enough people inside Alamut had embraced the Nizari faith that Mahdi found himself outnumbered in his own fortress. Hassan offered him 3,000 gold dinars and safe passage. Mahdi took the money and left. Not a drop of blood marked the transfer. The fortress Hassan inherited was modest by the standards of the great castles of Persia or Syria. Its outer walls enclosed perhaps 2 acres of rocky ground. The main structure was stone, thick-walled and plain, with narrow arrow slits and a single arched gate reinforced with iron. There was a cistern carved into the rock, fed by winter rains and snowmelt, and a small granary. It was defensible but barely self-sufficient. Hassan set to work expanding it. He ordered the construction of additional storage vaults, dug deeper into the mountain to hold grain, oil, and dried fruit. He commissioned cisterns large enough to supply a garrison of several hundred for months without resupply. Agricultural terraces were carved into the slopes below the fortress, laboriously cleared of stone and planted with barley, lentils, and fruit trees. The work took years. It required stonemasons, labourers, and farmers, all drawn from the local population or recruited from Nizari communities elsewhere in Persia. The result was not a castle in the European sense, nor a palace, but a fortified mountain village designed to endure isolation. The library came next. Hassan was a scholar before he became a leader, and he understood that a movement built on theology and law required texts. He assembled manuscripts on Ismaili doctrine, jurisprudence, mathematics, astronomy, and history. Some were copied by scribes within Alamut, others were smuggled out of cities or purchased from booksellers in Isfahan and Baghdad. The library grew to hold thousands of volumes stored in dry chambers where the cold mountain air preserved the parchment and paper. It became a center of learning, drawing Ismaili scholars who could study and teach far from the scrutiny of Sunni authorities. The fortress was not merely a refuge, it was an intellectual capital. Hassan governed Alamut as both a fortress commander and a religious leader. He established a council of senior followers to administer daily affairs, food distribution, construction projects, defense rotations, and the education of younger members. Discipline was strict. Hassan himself lived austerely, sleeping in a small chamber and spending most of his time in study or correspondence. He rarely left the fortress after 1088, preferring to manage his growing network through letters carried by trusted couriers. Those letters reached other fortresses across northern Persia, as more Nizari communities sought the same strategy Hassan had pioneered. Girdku, Lamzar, Maimondiz, one by one strongholds in the Alborz and Zagros ranges came under Nizari control, some by conversion, some by purchase, a few by force. Each fortress anchored a cluster of villages, creating a scattered but resilient state bound by faith and mutual defense. Life inside Alamut followed a rhythm shaped by isolation and purpose. Men rose before dawn for prayers, then moved to their assigned tasks, repairing walls, grinding grain, copying manuscripts, training with weapons in the courtyard. Women managed kitchens, textile production, and the care of children, though sources say little about their specific roles or status within the community. Food was simple: bread, lentils, dried apricots, occasional mutton from the flocks pastured in the valleys below. Winters were harsh. Snow buried the terraces and cut the fortress off from the outside world for weeks. The garrison burned wood, brought up from the forests in summer, rationed carefully to last until spring. There were no luxuries, no excess. The fortress existed to survive and to serve as a base for operations far beyond its walls. The network expanded into Syria beginning in the early 1100s. Nizari missionaries crossed into the Levant, where Crusader states, Sunni dynasties, and local warlords competed for control of cities and trade routes. The mountainous region around Masyaf, southwest of Aleppo, offered terrain similar to the Alborz. By the middle of the 12th century, the Syrian Nizari had secured a chain of fortresses, the most famous being Masyaf itself. These strongholds operated semi-independently from Alamut, led by local commanders, but linked by shared doctrine and strategy. The Syrian fortresses faced different enemies: Crusader knights, the forces of Nur al-Din and later Saladin, and rival Muslim factions who regarded the Nizari as heretics. Yet the principle remained the same: a fortress in the mountains could not be easily conquered, and from that fortress, a small disciplined group could project influence far beyond its numbers. Hassan died in 1124, having ruled Alamut for 36 years. He never left the fortress after its seizure. His successors continued the work, refining the administration, expanding the library, and training the men who would carry out the missions that made the Nizari Ismailis famous. Alamut became a symbol as much as a place, a proof that a persecuted minority could carve out space, hold it, and build something lasting in a world dominated by empires. The fortress was not invincible, but it was close. Its walls held through Seljuk sieges, through factional wars, through decades of isolation. What stone and elevation could not achieve, however, required a different kind of strength. A fortress offers safety, but it cannot expand influence. For that, Hassan needed operatives who could move unseen through enemy cities, speak the languages of power, and strike without warning. He needed fedayeen, those willing to sacrifice themselves. Hassan I-Sabbah understood that fortresses alone could not reshape the balance of power. Stone walls might shelter a community, but they could not reach into the courts of sultans or the councils of viziers. For that, he needed men willing to walk into enemy territory, adopt foreign identities, and wait months or years for a single moment of violence. He needed individuals who saw their own death, not as a failure, but as the completion of a sacred task. The fedayeen, those who sacrificed themselves, became the operational core of the Nizari Ismailis strategy. They were not spontaneous fanatics or drug-addled zealots, but carefully selected and trained operatives whose effectiveness depended on discipline, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Recruitment began within Ismaili communities scattered across Persia and Syria, often in rural villages or among urban populations marginalized by Sunni political dominance. Young men, typically in their teens or early 20s, were identified by local missionaries known as dayas, who assessed not only religious devotion but temperament, intellect, and capacity for secrecy. Candidates often came from families with little wealth or political standing, for whom the promise of meaning and belonging carried immense weight. The Nizari movement offered what the broader world denied: a place within a community of purpose, access to education, and a role in a struggle framed as both theological and existential. Some recruits were volunteers, inspired by sermons or family tradition. Others were approached quietly, tested through conversations over months, their loyalty measured before any formal invitation was extended. Once selected, a recruit entered a long period of preparation that bore little resemblance to the sensational accounts written by later chroniclers. Training took place within the fortress complexes, particularly Alamet and its sister strongholds, where the daily rhythm blended religious study, physical conditioning, and practical instruction. The Fedayeen learned languages, for an operative moving through Seljuk territories needed fluent Persian and Arabic, while those sent into Crusader regions required competence in French or Latin. They studied theology deeply, not merely to reinforce faith but to engage in debates, adopt the guise of scholars or mystics, and navigate the intellectual environments of courts and mosques. Rhetoric mattered as much as blade work, since an assassin might spend years posing as a servant, a scribe, or a wandering Sufi before the order to strike ever came. Disguise was taught as both art and science. Operatives learned the dress, manners, and speech patterns of various social roles: the merchant's concern for profit, the servant's deference, the scholar's careful phrasing. They studied the routines of target environments, from the layout of mosques to the schedules of palace guards, absorbing details that would allow them to move without suspicion. Training emphasized patience and observation over bravado. A successful Fedayeen was unremarkable, forgettable, capable of vanishing into the human landscape of a city. Physical preparation included endurance, close combat techniques, and above all the use of the dagger. The preference for daggers over swords or bows was not accidental. A dagger could be concealed beneath robes, drawn quickly in close quarters, and used in crowded spaces where a sword would attract immediate attention. Battles required distance and preparation, leaving the operative exposed. The Fedayeen were trained for intimate violence, the kind that occurred within arm's reach, often in daylight in public view. Yet the question of motivation cannot be reduced to training alone. Why would a young man accept a mission that almost certainly ended in his own death, either in the act itself or through execution afterward? The answer lies in the intersection of theology, identity, and the structure of Ismaili belief. Nizari Ismailism placed enormous emphasis on the authority of the Imam, the spiritual leader believed to possess divine guidance and knowledge hidden from ordinary believers. Obedience to the Imam was not merely political loyalty, but a form of worship, a path to salvation. The concept of martyrdom within Ismaili thought drew from broader Islamic traditions, but was sharpened by the sect's embattled status. To die in service of the Imam, particularly in an act that advanced the community's survival, was framed as the highest form of devotion, a guarantee of immediate entry into paradise. This was not abstract theology. It was lived belief, reinforced through communal ritual, daily prayer, and the physical environment of the fortresses themselves, where every aspect of life oriented toward the Imam's will. For a Fedayeen, the mission became a form of spiritual completion, the moment when years of preparation and faith converged into a single irreversible action. The operative did not flee after the kill because flight implied doubt, a concern for earthly survival that contradicted the theological logic of the act. Capture and execution were expected, even welcomed, as proof of total commitment. This was not suicidal despair, but a carefully cultivated certainty, a psychological and spiritual architecture built over years within a community that validated and honored such sacrifice. The mythology of Hashish, which gave rise to the term assassin itself, demands scrutiny. The word Hashashin, meaning users of hashish, appears in hostile sources written by Sunni chroniclers and later amplified by Crusader writers and European travelers like Marco Polo. These accounts describe operatives drugged into obedience, promised visions of paradise through narcotic stupor, and manipulated by cunning leaders who exploited their altered states. The image is vivid and has persisted for centuries, but it collapses under examination. Operatives who spent months or years infiltrating enemy courts, learning languages, adopting false identities, and waiting for precise moments to strike could not function effectively under the influence of intoxicants. The tasks required clarity, discipline, and flawless judgment. Hashish, which impairs coordination and decision-making, would have been a liability, not an asset. The historical evidence points instead towards sobriety and rigor. Surviving Ismaili texts emphasize intellectual and spiritual discipline, not chemically induced delusion. The fortresses maintained libraries, not opium dens. The Fedayeen's reputation for patience and precision suggests training methods grounded in repetition, observation, and mental conditioning, not pharmacological shortcuts. The Hashish myth likely originated as propaganda, a way for enemies to delegitimize Nizari's successes by attributing them to trickery and drugs rather than skill and conviction. It also reflected broader medieval anxieties about heretical sects, secret societies, and the supposed susceptibility of the uneducated to manipulation. The myth served a purpose. It made the Nizari threat comprehensible within a framework that denied their agency and intelligence. The reality, far less exotic but far more effective, was that the Fedayeen were sober, patient, and driven by a belief system that required no chemical augmentation. The training system produced operatives capable of extraordinary patience. Historical accounts describe assassins who lived as trusted servants for years, attending to their targets' daily needs, before receiving the signal to act. Others posed as students in madrasas, religious schools, building reputations as devout scholars while waiting for a single fleeting opportunity. This operational model required not only individual discipline but a sophisticated command structure capable of maintaining contact with agents embedded in distant cities, often across hostile territory. The dayas, the missionaries who had initially recruited the Fedayeen, often served as intermediaries, relaying instructions through coded messages or trusted couriers. The network functioned because it was decentralized enough to survive the capture of individual operatives, yet cohesive enough to coordinate actions across regions. The Fedayeen were not interchangeable tools but individuals with distinct skills and assignments. Some specialized in urban operations, others in targeting military encampments. A few were trained specifically for high-value, high-risk missions against figures like Nizam al-Mulk or Conrad of Montferrat. These elite operatives received additional preparation, studying their targets' habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities with meticulous care. The assassination was not improvised violence but the culmination of intelligence gathering, planning, and rehearsal, executed with the precision of a surgical strike. The Fedayeen's willingness to die was not recklessness but the final variable in an equation that required someone willing to close the distance, commit the act, and accept the consequences without hesitation. With agents trained and positioned, the question remained: how do you choose a target, prepare an operation, and ensure success when failure means not just death, but the collapse of the entire network? An assassination begins long before the blade touches skin. It begins with the selection of a target whose death will send a message, with the identification of an operative willing to die, and with the patient gathering of information that transforms a fortress full of believers into a mechanism capable of reaching into the throne rooms and mosques of empires. The Nizari Ismailis understood that murder, properly executed, was not merely violence but a form of communication directed at audiences far beyond the victim. Every detail mattered: the timing, the setting, the manner of approach, the weapon, and the identity assumed by the killer. The mechanics of political assassination in the medieval world were less about brute force than about precision, patience, and the careful construction of opportunity. The selection of a target followed strategic logic rather than personal vendetta. Hassan I Sabbah and his successors chose victims whose deaths would shift the political landscape in measurable ways. Viziers who enacted anti-Ismaili policies, military commanders preparing campaigns against Nizari strongholds, rival religious scholars whose writings justified persecution, and occasionally crusader nobles whose removal served broader alliances or demonstrated reach into Christian territories. The victim had to be prominent enough that his death would be noticed and discussed, yet accessible enough that an operative could reach him without requiring an army. This meant focusing on officials who moved through public spaces, attended mosques or courts, and relied on civilian rather than purely military protection. A caliph surrounded by guards in a fortified palace was a poor target. A vizier who prayed at dawn in a known mosque was ideal. Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier who had governed the Seljuk Empire for 3 decades, embodied the kind of target Hassan I Sabah sought. He was the architect of Sunni orthodoxy's political enforcement across Persia, the man whose policies had driven Ismailis into hiding and turned their fortresses into refuges. His death would not topple the empire, but it would demonstrate that even the most powerful administrator was vulnerable, that 30 years of accumulated authority and the protection of the Sultan himself could not shield a man from a determined killer. On the morning of October 19, 1092, Nizam al-Mulk travelled by litter from Isfahan toward Baghdad. Pausing at a caravanserai near the town of Sana, he entered the courtyard and walked toward his tent. A man dressed in the simple robes of a Sufi mystic, a figure so common in the landscape of Persian religious life that he drew no particular scrutiny, approached the vizier as if to present a petition or seek a blessing. The blade came from beneath the robe, and the strike was delivered with enough force and accuracy that Nizam al-Mulk collapsed within moments. The assassin made no attempt to flee. He was cut down by guards immediately, his death as certain as his victims. The entire event from approach to execution lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The choice of disguise mattered as much as the weapon. The Sufi mystic was a figure associated with piety, poverty, and harmlessness, someone whose presence near a powerful man might even be considered auspicious. The operative who killed Nizam al-Mulk had not simply put on a robe that morning. He had studied the behaviors, the gait, the vocabulary, and the gestures of wandering mystics. He may have spent months or even years moving through towns and caravanserais in that role, building a persona that would allow him to approach a target without triggering alarm. This was the foundation of Hashashin infiltration strategy, the construction of an identity so convincing that it became invisible. Operatives posed as servants in the households of military commanders, as scholars in madrasas frequented by rival theologians, as merchants traveling trade routes used by Crusader nobles. The infiltration was not a matter of days but of seasons, and sometimes years. An agent might live in a city for 2 years, performing menial labor, attending prayers, forming shallow friendships, all while waiting for the moment when his target would be vulnerable and the political timing advantageous. Language skills were essential. An operative sent into Syria needed fluent Arabic and enough knowledge of local dialects to avoid suspicion. An agent targeting a Crusader lord needed sufficient Frankish or Latin to navigate Christian courts and understand the rhythms of their routines. Training at Alamet included not only the physical preparation for close combat with daggers, but also instruction in rhetoric, theology, and the social codes of different cultures. The goal was not to stand out as exceptional, but to blend so thoroughly into the background that no one would remember seeing the operative until after the killing. A servant who had cleaned a commander's chambers for 6 months, who knew when the man prayed alone and which door he used to enter his private garden, was worth more than a dozen fighters who could scale a wall but had no knowledge of the interior. The weapon of choice was almost always the dagger. Swords were conspicuous, difficult to conceal, and associated with open combat rather than covert murder. Bows required distance and sight lines that were rarely available in the urban settings where most assassinations occurred. The dagger could be hidden beneath a robe, drawn quickly, and used in close quarters where the victim had no time to react or call for help. It was personal, silent, and symbolically intimate. The act of assassination was not meant to resemble warfare, but to demonstrate that the target's death was deliberate, chosen, and inevitable. A man killed by a dagger in a mosque or a banquet hall died not in battle but in a space where he thought himself safe. That distinction amplified the psychological impact. Public settings were preferred over private ones, despite the increased risk to the operative. A murder witnessed by dozens of people sent a message that secrecy alone could not. It demonstrated that the Nizari Ismailis could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of guards or walls. It forced witnesses to carry the story outward, spreading fear and speculation. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, on April 28, 1192, exemplified this approach. Conrad had just left a dinner with the Bishop of Beauvais in the city of Tyre and was walking through the narrow streets toward his residence when two men approached him. Both were dressed as Christian monks, a disguise that had allowed them to move freely through the Crusader-held city for weeks or perhaps months. They struck simultaneously, driving daggers into Conrad's body with enough force that he fell immediately. One operative was killed on the spot by Conrad's guards. The other fled into a nearby church, where he was captured and executed after interrogation. Conrad died of his wounds within hours. The operational details reveal the depth of planning involved. The two operatives had not simply arrived in Tyre and improvised. They had adopted a credible cover, learned the layout of the city, identified Conrad's routines, and waited for a moment when he was moving through a public but not heavily guarded space. The use of two operatives rather than one increased the likelihood of success, and ensured that even if one was stopped, the other might complete the mission. The immediate deaths of both men were expected. Escape was not part of the plan. The operation succeeded, not despite the operatives' deaths, but because those deaths were calculated into the mission from the beginning. The willingness to die was not fanaticism, but a strategic decision rooted in the belief that martyrdom served both religious salvation and political necessity. Target selection extended beyond individual grudges to broader strategic goals. When the Syrian branch of the Nizari Ismailis, led by Rashid al-Din Sinan, operated in the Crusader states during the 12th century, their killings were often designed to influence the balance of power among competing Christian and Muslim factions. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat may have been carried out at the request of Richard the Lionheart, or it may have served Nizari interests in weakening a Crusader leader who threatened their Syrian fortresses. The historical record remains ambiguous, and perhaps that ambiguity was itself useful. The Hashashin cultivated an image of unpredictability, of being available as allies or enemies depending on circumstance. This made them valuable as potential partners and terrifying as potential adversaries. The mechanics of assassination required not only skilled operatives, but also an intelligence network capable of tracking targets, identifying vulnerabilities and relaying information back to command centers like Alamut or Masyaf. This network consisted of Ismaili communities scattered across cities and towns, merchants who traveled trade routes and gathered information, and sympathizers who provided shelter or logistical support. The operatives themselves were the visible tip of a much larger system of communication, coordination, and resource allocation. A single successful assassination depended on the work of dozens of people who would never be named or recognized, who provided false documents, safe houses, or simply a conversation overheard in a marketplace that revealed where a target would be on a particular day. The cumulative effect of these operations was not measured in body counts but in the alteration of behavior among those who might have been targets. Rulers began to fear their own servants. Viziers avoided public appearances or traveled with larger retinues. Religious scholars moderated their rhetoric against the Ismailis. Military campaigns were delayed or cancelled when commanders received warnings, real or fabricated, that an operative had been dispatched. The mere possibility of assassination became a form of deterrence, a shadow that followed every official who had ever spoken against the Nizari cause. In this way, the killings themselves were only part of the strategy. The rest was reputation, rumor, and the quiet reshaping of choices made by men who did not want to die in a courtyard at dawn. Each successful operation sent a message far beyond the death itself. Fear became currency, and the mere threat of assassination reshaped alliances, policies, and the behavior of rulers who once thought themselves untouchable. The death itself was never enough. A vizier slumped in a courtyard, a blade in his ribs, blood pooling on stone. This alone would not shift the calculus of empires. What transformed murder into statecraft was the story that came after: the whispers in bazaars, the letters carried to distant courts, the slow spread of a single conviction that nowhere was safe, that patience was infinite, that the Nizari Ismailis could reach anyone. Hassan I Sabah understood this with unusual clarity. His fortresses were few, his armies smaller still, and the Seljuk Empire commanded resources he could never match in open battle. But fear required no soldiers. Fear travelled on rumour, flourished in uncertainty, and grew stronger each time a target fell in circumstances that seemed impossible. The Hashashin did not simply kill, they performed executions in ways designed to haunt the imagination of everyone who heard the details second-hand. The cultivated reputation began with choices made in the planning of each operation. Targets were often killed in public, in daylight, surrounded by guards and courtiers who could do nothing to prevent it. The assassin who struck Nizam el-Mulk wore the clothing of a Sufi mystic, a figure meant to inspire piety rather than suspicion, and approached openly in a mosque courtyard where dozens of witnesses stood nearby. The message was not subtle, devotion could disguise danger, and no amount of security could guarantee survival. When word of the killing spread, it carried with it the eerie detail that the assassin had made no effort to escape, had stood calmly as guards seized him, had accepted death as though it were a foregone conclusion. This was not the behavior of a desperate man or a common murderer. It suggested something far more unsettling, a certainty, perhaps even eagerness, that transformed the act into something almost ritualistic. Other stories emphasized patience and inevitability. Chroniclers recorded accounts of operatives who spent years in the service of a target, rising through the ranks of a household or military retinue, earning trust and proximity, waiting for the single moment when the blade could be drawn without warning. These narratives may have been exaggerated in the retelling, but they reflected a strategic reality. Long-term infiltration was indeed a Nizari method, and the knowledge that an enemy might already be inside one's own household created a paranoia that no fortress wall could alleviate. A Seljuk commander might look at his servants and wonder which among them had been placed there months or years earlier, living a double life with flawless discipline, studying routines and vulnerabilities while performing mundane tasks. The uncertainty itself became a weapon. It poisoned trust, strained alliances, and made rulers hesitant to rely on subordinates whose loyalty could never be fully verified. The Hashashin also deployed symbolic gestures designed to communicate specific threats without committing violence. The most famous of these involved the dagger, left on a pillow. According to multiple accounts from Crusader sources and later Islamic chronicles, operatives occasionally bypassed the kill entirely and instead placed a blade beside a sleeping target, demonstrating that access had been achieved and death deferred only by choice. Whether these incidents occurred exactly as described remains uncertain, but the story's persistence across different sources suggests it resonated as plausible. The psychological impact was profound. A ruler who woke to find such an object would understand immediately that his guards had failed, that walls and locks had been circumvented, and that his survival depended not on his own defenses, but on the forbearance of an enemy who could strike whenever convenient. The gesture transformed the relationship from one of mutual hostility into something closer to conditional mercy, with the Nizari Ismailis positioned as arbiters of life and death. Written warnings served a similar function. Letters arrived at courts across Persia and Syria, unsigned or marked only with cryptic symbols, informing recipients that they had been judged and found wanting. Some messages included specific details, dates, locations, names of confidants, to prove that surveillance had been thorough and omnipresent. The purpose was not always to announce an imminent killing, but to create a sustained state of anxiety, to make the target aware that he was being watched and evaluated according to criteria he might not fully understand. This was psychological pressure applied with precision, intended to influence behavior, extract concessions, or discourage hostile actions against Nizari interests. A Seljuk governor receiving such a letter might reconsider his plans to besiege a Nizari fortress, or a Crusader lord might pause before breaking a truce. The threat, merely by existing, became leverage. Theatrical executions amplified the message further. When operatives struck in crowded markets or during religious festivals, the act became spectacle. Witnesses carried descriptions to every corner of the region, and each retelling added layers of interpretation. Some chroniclers described assassins laughing as they were seized or reciting prayers, or proclaiming the righteousness of their cause with voices that carried across courtyards. Whether these details were accurate or embellished by those who heard them third-hand mattered less than the cumulative effect. The Hashashin were framed not as desperate rebels but as devoted instruments of divine will, willing to die because they believed paradise awaited them. This narrative made them seem unstoppable not through strength but through conviction, a far more troubling quality for their enemies to contemplate. Crusader chroniclers seized on these stories with fascination and horror. William of Tyre, writing in the late 12th century, described the Nizari Ismailis as a heretical sect whose members obeyed their master with absolute and terrifying loyalty. His account, shaped by limited understanding of Ismaili theology and filtered through the prejudices of a Christian European observer, emphasized the exotic and the sinister. He wrote of men who killed without hesitation and accepted death without fear, driven by promises he could not fully explain, but which clearly unsettled him. Other writers followed his lead, adding their own elaborations. The figure of the Old Man of the Mountain emerged in these texts as a kind of dark sorcerer, commanding legions of devoted killers from his remote fortress, wielding fear as a supernatural force. The reality, a minority religious community using assassination as a tool of survival and political leverage, was less dramatic but also less comprehensible to audiences unfamiliar with the sectarian complexities of 12th century Islam. Marco Polo, traveling through Persia in the late 13th century, decades after the fall of Alamut, recorded stories he heard from locals and merchants. His account introduced the legend of a false paradise, a hidden garden filled with fountains, silks, and beautiful attendants, where recruits were brought under the influence of hashish to experience what awaited them in the afterlife if they died in service to their master. The tale was vivid, memorable, and almost certainly fabricated or borrowed from earlier folklore. No contemporary Nizari sources mention such a garden, and the logistical and theological implausibilities are significant. Yet the story spread across Europe, reinforced by repeated retellings, and became one of the most enduring myths associated with the Hashashin. It satisfied a narrative need. It provided a mechanism to explain the otherwise inexplicable willingness of young men to undertake suicide missions. The truth, that religious devotion, communal identity, and the promise of martyrdom could motivate such acts without drugs or deception, was harder for medieval European audiences to accept. The word itself began to transform. Assassin, derived likely from Hashashin, or assassin, entered Latin, French, and eventually English not as a specific reference to the Nizari Ismailis, but as a general term for anyone who killed for political or financial reasons. By the 14th century, the term had detached almost entirely from its origins. A hired killer in Florence or a nobleman murdered during a dynastic feud might be described using language borrowed from stories about the Hashashin, even though the circumstances bore little resemblance to the operations conducted from Alamut or Masyaf. The mythology had become portable, adaptable, and ultimately more influential than the historical reality it distorted. This transformation was not entirely accidental. The Nizari Ismailis themselves benefited from the fear their reputation generated, and they had little incentive to correct exaggerations that served their strategic interests. A legend of invincibility was useful even if partially false. It deterred enemies, impressed potential allies, and compensated for material weaknesses. The blurred line between fact and myth became part of the weapon itself, a psychological force multiplier that extended the reach of a small besieged community far beyond what its actual numbers could achieve. But the Hashashin did not operate in isolation. Medieval assassination was a tool used by many, from Christian Europe to Imperial China, each adapting murder to the constraints and opportunities of their own political landscapes. Medieval Europe had no Alamut. It had no network of fortresses devoted to political murder, no cadre of trained killers waiting in mountain halls for orders from a Grand Master. What it had instead was something more diffuse and harder to see, a culture in which political killing happened constantly, justified differently, depending on who held the blade and who paid for it, wrapped in the language of justice, honor, and divine will. The act itself was common. The honesty about it was not. The question was never whether rulers would kill rivals. The question was how to do so without appearing to violate the codes that supposedly governed Christian kingship. In theory, a knight fought openly, a king ruled justly, and murder was sin. In practice, throats were cut in hallways, rivals disappeared on roads, and blame dissolved into convenient shadows. The difference between Europe and the Nizari Ismailis was not the presence of assassination. It was the absence of anyone willing to claim it as policy. On the evening of December 29th, 1170, 4 knights rode into Canterbury Cathedral and killed Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, as he stood near the altar. They cut him down with swords in front of his own clergy, splitting his skull open on the stone floor. The killing was sudden, brutal, and committed in one of the holiest sites in England. It was also the direct result of words spoken weeks earlier by King Henry II, who had raged aloud about the troublesome priest who defied him. The king never gave an order. He never named Becket. He simply made his frustration known, and 4 men interpreted that frustration as permission. This was the architecture of plausible deniability. Henry had not commanded murder. He had merely spoken in anger, a lapse any man might suffer. That the knights acted on those words, that they rode armed into a cathedral and killed an archbishop, could be framed as their failure, their excess, their sin. Henry performed public penance. He walked barefoot to Becket's tomb and allowed himself to be whipped by monks. The church declared Becket a martyr. The knights were condemned, yet Henry retained his throne, his power intact, the threat removed. The system had worked exactly as intended. The church itself was trapped in a permanent contradiction. Murder was sin. Scripture was clear. Canon law was clear. Yet the church operated in a world where its bishops were also feudal lords, where its lands were contested, where its authority was defended by men who carried swords. When a king killed an enemy, the church might call it justice. When a rebel killed a king, it was sacrilege. The difference was not moral, it was political. Thomas Aquinas, writing a century after Becket's death, laid out the conditions under which killing a tyrant might be acceptable. He was careful, hedging his arguments with qualifications, but the logic was there. A ruler who violated divine or natural law forfeited legitimacy, and removing such a ruler could, in some circumstances, be lawful. But who decided when a king became a tyrant, and who held the blade? Aquinas did not provide operational instructions. He left the matter suspended in theory, which meant it remained available for anyone bold enough to act and clever enough to argue afterward. The problem with honor was that it demanded visibility. A knight was supposed to fight openly, to meet his enemy face to face, to risk his own life in combat that could be witnessed and judged. Assassination violated all of this. It was secret, one-sided, unsporting. A knight who ambushed an unarmed man or struck from behind risked not just condemnation, but the collapse of his own social identity. His reputation was his currency. Lose it, and he lost everything. This did not stop murder. It simply changed how murder was performed. It meant that those who killed politically either did so in ways that could be framed as something else, a duel, an accident, a lawful execution, or they used people whose honor did not matter, servants, mercenaries, foreigners, men without land or title who could be paid, used, and discarded. The hiring of such men left no formal record. Contracts were verbal, payments were laundered through intermediaries. When the deed was done, the killer either fled or was killed in turn, erasing the link. On the 10th of September 1419, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, walked onto the bridge at Montereau to meet with representatives of the Dauphin Charles. The meeting had been arranged under truce, a formal negotiation meant to settle the civil war tearing France apart. John entered a wooden enclosure built on the bridge, a space meant to ensure security and privacy. Once inside, the gate was closed behind him. Men loyal to the Dauphin surrounded him. He was struck down with swords and axes, killed within moments. His body was left on the bridge. This was not the work of a lone assassin. It was an organized execution disguised as a meeting carried out by armed men acting on orders from the highest levels of the French court. No one pretended it was honorable. The Dauphin's supporters justified it as revenge. 13 years earlier, John the Fearless had orchestrated the murder of Louis, Duke of Orleans, in the streets of Paris. That killing too had been planned, public, and unapologetic. John had hired men to ambush Louis, then defended the act in front of the French court, arguing that removing a corrupt advisor was justified. He won that argument. He remained powerful for over a decade. His death at Montereau was repayment in kind. The cycle of vendetta this created was structural. In a world without strong central authority, where royal power was weak or contested, noble families acted as independent powers. Insults required satisfaction. Injuries demanded revenge. When one side used murder, the other side replied with murder. The lack of formal assassin organizations did not mean less killing. It meant killing embedded in feudal logic, passed down through generations, tangled with inheritance, marriage, and land. The tools were simple. A blade in the dark required no special training. Poison could be bought or made. Hired killers were available in any city with a port or a market. What required skill was not the killing itself, but the management of consequences. A ruler who killed too openly risked rebellion or invasion. A noble who murdered a rival without justification could lose allies. The trick was to kill in ways that could be explained, defended, or blamed on someone else. Some rulers kept men whose purpose was barely hidden. They were called different things: household knights, personal guards, trusted servants. Their job was to handle problems that could not be solved through law or negotiation. They accompanied rulers on campaign. They guarded chambers at night. They traveled on sensitive errands. If a rival noble died in an ambush on a road, if a rebellious bishop was found dead in his quarters, these men were nowhere nearby. And yet somehow the problem was solved. No contracts survived. No formal orders existed. Loyalty was rewarded with land, titles, or gold, and silence was understood. The church condemned such acts when convenient and ignored them when not. A bishop murdered by a rival faction was a martyr. A bishop who supported the wrong claimant and died quietly was seldom mentioned. The same pope who denounced regicide might bless a war against a heretic king, and war was simply murder on a larger scale. The moral clarity Scripture promised collapsed under the weight of territorial politics, inheritance disputes, and the endless contest for resources and authority. What medieval Europe lacked was the honesty of the Hashashin. The Fedayeen struck openly, in daylight with witnesses. They accepted capture and death as part of the mission. They made no effort to pretend the killing was anything other than what it was. European assassination, by contrast, hid behind accidents, duels, judicial murders, and the tangled justifications of theology and law. The victim was always guilty of something. The killer was always acting on higher principle. The truth was rarely spoken aloud, yet the truth was simple. Political murder was a tool, used when other tools failed, adapted to the constraints of culture, law, and religion. In Europe, those constraints meant that the tool was deployed quietly, justified elaborately, and blamed strategically. The professional killer existed, but he was not part of a formal institution. He was a man for hire, a loyal retainer, a knight who bent the rules, a servant who understood what silence was worth. He lived in the margins of the system, used when needed and forgotten when convenient. Far to the east, assassination had an even older pedigree. In China, the act of killing a tyrant was woven into philosophy, history, and the very concept of righteous rebellion. The Hashashin drew power from a theological certainty and a network of mountain fortresses, but they were not the first to make assassination a calculated tool of statecraft. Centuries before Hassanai Saba seized Alamut, rulers and rebels across Asia had refined the art of political murder into something simultaneously pragmatic and philosophical. In China, assassination was debated by scholars and embedded in historical memory. In India, it was systematized into manuals of governance. In Japan, covert killing evolved quietly in the margins of samurai culture, unromanticized and unrecorded. These traditions shared little in doctrine or method, but all grappled with the same tension. whether the killing of a tyrant or rival could ever be righteous, and whether honor permitted what necessity demanded. The most famous assassination attempt in Chinese history occurred on an autumn day in 227 before the Common Era, in the court of the man who would soon become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China. A scholar and swordsman named Jing Qi approached the throne carrying a rolled map, a gift from the defeated state of Yan. Hidden inside the map was a poisoned dagger. As Jing Qi unfurled the scroll before the king, the blade fell free. He lunged. The king stumbled backward, his ceremonial sword too long to draw quickly in the narrow space. Jing Qi missed. Courtiers froze, forbidden by law to carry weapons in the presence of the throne. A physician hurled his medicine bag at the assassin. The king finally drew his blade and struck Jing Qi down. The man died slowly, slumped against a pillar, and his failure ensured the survival of the ruler who would burn books, build the Great Wall, and bury scholars alive. Sima Qian, the grand historian of the Han dynasty, recorded the event in meticulous detail more than a century later. He treated Jing Qi not as a criminal, but as a tragic figure, a man of courage and skill, undone by hesitation and circumstance. The account includes dialogue, sensory detail, and a melancholy admiration for the assassin's loyalty to his doomed state. This was not accidental. Chinese historiography carried within it a long philosophical debate about tyrannicide, rooted in Confucian and Mencian thought. Mencius, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, argued that a ruler who abandoned virtue ceased to be a true king and became merely a commoner, subject to removal or death. To kill such a man was not rebellion but justice. This idea never became state doctrine, but it lingered in the scholarly class, surfacing in histories and commentaries as a kind of moral counterweight to imperial authority. The tension was never resolved. Dynasties rose and fell through violence, and assassination played a recurring role in palace coups, succession crises, and the elimination of officials who grew too powerful. Yet open endorsement of political murder remained dangerous. Confucian ethics demanded loyalty to the ruler, even a flawed one, and the concept of filial piety extended upward to the emperor as the father of the state. Assassins like Jing Qi were remembered with ambivalence, honored in poetry and opera, but never as models for emulation. The act remained morally unstable, admired in failure, condemned in success, and studied endlessly in the safe distance of historical narrative. India approached assassination with less ambivalence and more system. The Artha Shastra, a Sanskrit treatise on statecraft attributed to Kautilya, advisor to the Mauryan emperor Chandragupta in the 4th century before the Common Era, treats espionage and covert killing as ordinary instruments of rule. The text is comprehensive and coldly practical, outlining the recruitment of spies, the use of assassins disguised as ascetics or merchants, and the deployment of women trained in seduction and poison. It describes the construction of secret passages in palaces, the testing of food for toxins, and the cultivation of agents within enemy courts. Assassination is neither glorified nor condemned. It is simply another lever of power to be used when diplomacy or warfare proves inefficient. Poison was the preferred method, both for its subtlety and its deniability. The Artha Shastra catalogues various toxins, plant extracts, snake venoms, mineral compounds, and preparations that could be applied to clothing, jewelry, or the edges of drinking vessels. Female agents, often recruited from courtesans or widows, were trained to administer poison during intimate encounters. The text acknowledges the risks agents could be discovered, tortured, or turned. It recommends that operatives be expendable, drawn from marginal classes, and given minimal knowledge of their employers. The logic was transactional. Loyalty could not be assumed, so it was replaced with ignorance and incentive. This approach persisted across centuries and kingdoms. Medieval Indian courts employed networks of informants and killers, often operating under the guise of religious mendicants or traveling performers. The line between espionage and assassination blurred. A spy who learned of a plot might eliminate the plotter rather than report. A poisoner might also gather intelligence. The system was decentralized and opportunistic, lacking the fortress infrastructure of the Nizari Ismailis, but compensating with flexibility and redundancy. Indian rulers understood that the palace was the most dangerous place they inhabited, and they built elaborate precautions, food tasters, rotating guards, secret sleeping chambers, and trusted eunuchs who could enter private spaces without suspicion. Japan developed its own traditions of covert warfare, though the romanticized image of the black-clad ninja belongs to later centuries and popular imagination. During the medieval period, particularly in the chaos of the Sengoku era from the mid-15th to early 17th centuries, warlords employed irregular fighters known as shinobi or rapper. These were not mystic assassins, but scouts, saboteurs, and infiltrators, often drawn from rural communities on the margins of samurai society. They gathered intelligence, set fires, poisoned wells, and occasionally killed sentries or officers in night raids. Their methods were pragmatic and inglorious: disguise, patience, knowledge of terrain, and the willingness to do work that violated the honor codes governing samurai combat. Samurai culture prized open confrontation, ritual, and loyalty, values poorly suited to assassination. A samurai who killed by stealth risked disgrace, but warlords still needed such work done. The solution was delegation. Shinobi operated outside the formal military hierarchy, often hired as temporary contractors rather than retained retainers. They carried no hereditary rank and earned no glory. Their existence was acknowledged quietly, their successes attributed to fortune or the incompetence of the enemy. Some regions, particularly the mountains of Iga and Koga, became known for producing skilled operatives, families passing down techniques of disguise, lock-picking, and silent movement. But these were craft traditions, not religious orders. There was no ideology, no paradise promised, no sacred text justifying the blade. The philosophical gap between Chinese and Japanese approaches reveals a broader truth about assassination in Asia. In China, the act was woven into debates about virtue, legitimacy, and the responsibilities of scholars toward tyranny. It was a problem of ethics, endlessly discussed and rarely resolved. In India, assassination was a tool described in governance manuals, systematized and deployed without moral hand-wringing. In Japan, it was an embarrassing necessity, outsourced to those who lived beyond the boundaries of honor. All three traditions produced effective killers, but the meanings attached to their work differed profoundly. One culture philosophized, one codified, and one averted its gaze. Yet, pragmatism united them. Whether debated in Confucian academies, encoded in Sanskrit statecraft manuals, or whispered about in Japanese war camps, assassination served those who lacked the strength to wage open war or the patience to wait for rivals to die naturally. It was efficient, deniable, and terrifying in its precision. The methods varied by geography and culture: poison in India, the dagger in China, fire and chaos in Japan. But the underlying calculus remained constant. A single death could shift the balance of power more decisively than a siege, and the fear of that death could be leveraged into compliance. The Hashashin would have recognized this logic, though their fortress state and religious cohesion gave them advantages few Asian assassins enjoyed. They built an institution where others relied on networks or individual agents. They created mythology where others operated in silence. But the fundamental act, the willingness to kill for strategic gain, belonged to no single culture. It was a feature of medieval statecraft everywhere, adapted to local constraints and justified by whatever moral framework a society could construct around it. Yet for all the varieties of method and motive, one force would eventually destroy the most famous assassins of the medieval world, the Mongols, who brought not subtlety but annihilation. The Nizari fortresses had endured sieges before. Seljuk armies had surrounded Alamut in the early decades of the 12th century of the Common Era and accomplished nothing beyond exhausting their own supplies. The Crusader states had tested Syrian Hashashin strongholds and learned that mountain castles defended by men willing to die were poor investments of time and blood. By the middle of the 13th century, the Nizari Ismailis state had survived for more than a century and a half, a patchwork of fortified peaks connected by faith, couriers, and the shared knowledge that their enemies controlled the plains but could not reach the sky. Then the Mongols arrived, and survival stopped being negotiable. The Mongol conquest of the Islamic world began not with religious hatred, but with the systematic dismantling of any power that might threaten the empire's western flank. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, crossed the Oxus River in 1253 with an army estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, including Chinese siege engineers, Persian guides, and contingents from every people the Mongols had previously subdued. His orders from his brother Monkey Khan, the Great Khan in Karakoram, were explicit: destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and eliminate any regional powers capable of resisting Mongol authority. The Nizari Ismailis, with their network of fortresses and their history of killing rulers who displeased them, qualified decisively. The Hashashin had attempted negotiation. Envoys from Alamut travelled to Hulagu's camp offering submission, tribute, and the promise of intelligence services against mutual enemies. The Mongols had used assassins before. They understood the value of men who could kill from within. But Hulagu's strategic calculus did not favour half measures. A vassal assassin sect still controlled fortresses, still commanded loyalty, still represented a potential threat during any future rebellion or succession crisis. The Mongols preferred solutions that did not require trust. In 1255, Hulagu sent word that the Nizari fortresses would be dismantled and their leadership executed. Submission would be measured, not in promises, but in the surrender of every castle and the personal appearance of the imam at the Mongol camp. Negotiation was over. Alamut had been built to withstand anything a medieval army could deliver. Its walls rose from cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into river gorges. Its cisterns held water for years. Its storerooms were stocked with grain, dried fruit, and salted meat sufficient to outlast any conventional siege. The problem was that the Mongols did not conduct conventional sieges. They brought counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds with enough force to crack fortifications designed for arrows and battering rams. They brought Chinese engineers who understood angles, trajectories, and the physics of walls under sustained bombardment. They brought patience measured not in weeks but in seasons, and a willingness to surround a fortress and simply wait while their cavalry consumed the surrounding countryside, ensuring that no relief force could approach and no supply caravan could break through. The siege began in earnest in late 1256. Mongol forces surrounded not just Alamut, but the entire network of Nizari fortresses across northern Persia, coordinating attacks to prevent any stronghold from sending aid to another. At Alamut itself, trebuchets were positioned on high ground within range of the outer walls. The bombardment was methodical. Stones struck the same sections of wall repeatedly, day after day, widening cracks and dislodging blocks until entire segments collapsed into rubble. The Nizaris repaired what they could, but stone and mortar require time, and the Mongols did not pause. Sorties from the gates were met with disciplined arrow volleys from mounted archers who could shoot accurately at full gallop. The Hashashin were trained for infiltration, disguise, and close combat in urban alleys, not for pitched battles against steppe cavalry operating in open terrain. Inside the fortress, the Imam Ruknul din Kushar faced an impossible position. He was young, having inherited leadership only a few years earlier, and he lacked the unshakable authority of Hassan I Sabah or the long experience of his predecessors. The fortress's defences were holding, but supplies were finite, and no allied force existed that could challenge a Mongol army in the field. The Abbasid Caliphate, once a potential mediator, had been obliterated earlier that same year when Hulagu's forces sacked Baghdad and executed the Caliph. The Nizaris were alone. In November of 1256, after weeks of bombardment and with sections of Alamut's walls reduced to broken teeth, Ruknul din Kushar sent word that he would surrender personally to Hulagu Khan if the lives of his people were spared. Hulagu accepted. Ruknul din descended from Alamut with a small retinue and presented himself at the Mongol camp. He was received politely, kept under guard, and sent on a tour of Mongol territories that took him eastward toward Karakoram, ostensibly to meet the Great Khan and formalize his submission. The journey lasted months. While he travelled, Mongol forces entered Alamut and the other Nizari fortresses. The garrisons were disarmed. The fortifications were systematically demolished. Walls pulled down and towers collapsed so thoroughly that future rebels would find no refuge there. The libraries, famous throughout the Islamic world for their collections of Ismaili theology, philosophy, astronomy, and history, were destroyed. Books were burned or scattered. Manuscripts that had survived centuries were lost in days. What the Mongols preserved, if anything, were practical texts on administration and taxation. The rest, including most primary sources documenting Nizari beliefs and internal history, disappeared. Rukn al-Din never reached Karakoram. Somewhere in the mountains of Persia, on the return journey, he and his companions were executed. The exact details are disputed among sources, but the outcome was consistent. The last Imam of Alamut was dead, and the line of leadership that had guided the Nizari state since 1088 of the Common Era was severed. The executions extended to captured Nizari commanders, scholars, and anyone identified as holding authority within the sect. The Mongols did not pursue mass slaughter of ordinary Ismaili believers, but they eliminated the organizational structure that had made the Hashashin a coherent political force. Some Nizari communities survived in remote valleys and villages, particularly in Syria, where the fortresses were farther from the Mongol advance, and where Mamluk forces eventually checked the Mongol westward push. Other groups fled into diaspora, scattering across Persia, Central Asia, and eventually into India, where Ismaili communities had existed since earlier missionary efforts. The faith itself did not die. Ismaili theology and practice continued in fragmented form, preserved by communities that maintained their beliefs quietly, without fortresses or formal state structures. Leadership eventually reconsolidated under new imams who traced their descent through different lines, though the continuity was contested and the historical record fragmentary. What ended in 1256 was not Ismailism but the Nizari political experiment. The idea that a minority sect could survive hostile empires through strategic fortification and the calculated use of assassination. The fortresses proved vulnerable to sufficient force applied by an enemy indifferent to casualties and willing to invest the resources necessary for total victory. The assassinations proved irrelevant against a Mongol command structure that did not depend on individual viziers or kings, and that responded to the murder of its commanders, not with fear but with annihilation. The Mongols had faced steppe rivals, Chinese dynasties and Persian kingdoms. A mountain sect armed with daggers and theology did not register as a meaningful threat, only as an item on a checklist of regional powers to be neutralized before moving west toward Mamluk Egypt and the Mediterranean. The physical destruction was mirrored by a textual one, with the libraries gone, the internal documents that would have explained Nizari training methods, theological debates, operational planning, and daily governance were lost. What survived were accounts written by outsiders, hostile Sunni chroniclers, fascinated Crusader observers, and later writers working from hearsay and legend. The Nizaris became a story told by their enemies, and the gap between what they were and what they were said to be widened with every retelling. The men who had lived in Alamut, studied in its libraries, and walked its corridors left almost no direct testimony. Their voices, like the stones of their fortress, were scattered into silence. With Alamut in ruins, the Hashashin passed from history into legend. But the concept they embodied, murder as statecraft, fear as leverage, did not vanish. It simply evolved. With Alamut in ruins and the final Imam dead, the daggers fell silent. Yet within decades, travelers and chroniclers from lands far beyond the ruined fortresses began to write. What they recorded bore little resemblance to the patient operatives who had once moved through Isfahan or Damascus with languages on their tongues and blades hidden in their sleeves. Instead, Europe and the wider world received tales of drugged paradise gardens, hypnotized killers, and a mystic overlord who commanded absolute obedience through sorcery and deception. The transformation from historical sect to enduring myth occurred swiftly, shaped by fear, fascination, and the inability of outsiders to comprehend a movement that combined religious devotion with ruthless pragmatism. The most famous mythologizer arrived decades after Alamut fell. Marco Polo, writing or dictating his travels around the year 1298, while imprisoned in Genoa, devoted a substantial passage to what he called the Old Man of the Mountain. According to Polo, this figure maintained a secret valley equipped as an earthly paradise, lush gardens watered by channels flowing with wine, milk and honey, populated by beautiful women trained in music and seduction. Young men were drugged with hashish, Polo claimed, then carried unconscious into this garden, where they awoke believing themselves in the heaven promised by Muhammad. After days of pleasure, they were drugged again and returned to the fortress, whereupon the old man informed them that only through complete obedience and martyrdom could they return to paradise permanently. Thus rendered fanatically loyal, these assassins would undertake any mission without hesitation, believing death merely a doorway back to bliss. The account contains narrative elegance and psychological logic of a kind that appealed to medieval and modern readers alike. It explained the otherwise inexplicable, why men would accept suicide missions, why they seemed fearless, why they struck with apparent randomness yet unerring precision. The problem, of course, is that nearly every detail is either fabricated or borrowed from earlier legends. No archaeological evidence supports the existence of such a garden at Alamut or any other Nizari fortress. The water systems at Alamut were sophisticated but designed for storage and agriculture, not ornamental channels of wine. The library destroyed by the Mongols contained theological and philosophical texts, not manuals for drugging and indoctrinating recruits. Polo himself never visited Alamut, which had been destroyed decades before his journey eastward. He likely compiled his account from stories told by Persian informants or fellow travelers, tales already shaped by decades of embellishment and fear. Yet Polo did not invent the myth from nothing. Earlier Crusader chronicles had already begun constructing the legend, and Syrian writers contemporary with the Hashashin themselves occasionally employed exaggerated rhetoric when describing their enemies. The term Hashashin, whether it originally referred to users of hashish or was simply a pejorative meaning outcast or rabble, certainly circulated in some form. Hostile Sunni scholars writing about the Nizaris occasionally accused them of drug use alongside other charges meant to delegitimize their theology. What Polo did was synthesize scattered accusations and fears into a coherent narrative that satisfied European expectations of how the mysterious East operated through sensuality, deception, and exotic excess, rather than through the disciplined study and ideological commitment that actually characterized Alamut. The garden myth spread rapidly through European literature precisely because it required no understanding of Ismaili theology, Shia succession disputes, or the political desperation that drove Hassan I Sabah to fortresses and blades. It reduced complexity to spectacle. By the 14th century, European writers used the term assassin to describe any politically motivated killer, severing the word entirely from its sectarian origins. The process mirrored how other terms migrated and mutated. Thug from the Thuggee of India, zealot from the Jewish Sicarii. Each word carried a residue of Orientalist fantasy, a sense that fanaticism and murder were endemic to non-Christian lands, products of alien religions and moral systems rather than rational responses to specific political conditions. The transformation accelerated during the 19th and early 20th centuries when European colonial scholars and adventure writers rediscovered the Hashashin. Orientalist literature of this period delighted in secret societies, hidden fortresses, and the supposed tendency of Eastern peoples toward mysticism and unthinking obedience. The Hashashin became stock figures in popular fiction, depicted as robed, dagger-wielding zealots lurking in shadows, awaiting orders from mysterious masters. Academic scholarship of the era often fared little better. Historians working primarily from Crusader chronicles and Marco Polo treated the garden story as fact, or at least as plausible metaphor, because it aligned with prevailing assumptions about Islamic culture and the psychology of religious violence. Only in the mid-20th century did serious revision begin. Scholars gained access to surviving Ismaili texts preserved in Yemen, Syria, and India, as well as hostile but contemporaneous accounts by Sunni historians like Jawini, who accompanied the Mongol invasion and described Alamut before its destruction. These sources revealed a community intensely focused on learning, law, and theological debate. The library at Alamut had been renowned across Persia, attracting scholars even from communities opposed to Nizari beliefs. Hassan I Sabah himself spent years studying in Cairo and Isfahan before seizing Alamut, and his writings, fragments of which survived, demonstrate sophisticated engagement with Islamic philosophy and jurisprudence, not the cynical manipulation of drugged adolescents. The Fedayeen themselves, examined through operational accounts rather than mythic frameworks, emerge as trained operatives rather than mesmerized automatons. They learned languages because infiltration required conversation and credibility. They studied the routines and vulnerabilities of their targets because success depended on planning, not mystical immunity to fear. The religious devotion that motivated them was real, rooted in a theology that promised martyrdom in defense of the true imam, held spiritual rewards. But this was standard across many medieval religious and military movements, from crusading knights to Buddhist warrior monks. What made the Hashashin unusual was not the intensity of their faith, but the precision and patience of their methods, and the willingness to accept that each operation would likely cost the operative his life. Modern Ismaili communities, which survived the destruction of Alamut and eventually coalesced under leadership that continues to the present through the Aga Khan, have worked to reclaim their history from legend. Scholars within these communities and sympathetic outsiders have published extensively, drawing on internal histories, theological texts, and reinterpretations of hostile sources to construct a more accurate picture. The result is a portrait of a minority sect that used assassination not from fanaticism but from necessity, as the only viable tool against vastly stronger enemies. The operations were acts of statecraft, not random terrorism, carefully chosen to destabilize opponents, protect Nizari communities, and demonstrate that even the most powerful rulers remained vulnerable. Yet the mythology persists alongside the scholarship. The word assassin still evokes images shaped more by Marco Polo and Victorian adventure novels than by the historical Nizari Ismailis. The Garden of Paradise appears in films, games, and popular histories, despite being thoroughly debunked. This durability reflects something deeper than ignorance. The myth of the Hashashin serves a narrative need. It provides a clear, comprehensible story of manipulation and control, of evil masterminds and brainwashed killers, that avoids the uncomfortable reality of intelligent, devout individuals choosing violence as the least bad option within systems that offered them no protection or legitimacy. Recognizing the Hashashin as rational actors operating within specific historical constraints requires acknowledging that political murder can be both morally complex and strategically effective, a conclusion many prefer to avoid by retreating into tales of drugs and gardens. The task of separating history from myth remains incomplete. Too many primary sources were destroyed with Alamut. Too many accounts come from enemies or outsiders, with little understanding of Ismaili theology. What survives must be read carefully, cross-referenced and contextualized within the broader political and religious landscape of the Seljuk and Crusader periods. Each generation of scholars refines the picture slightly, but the legend, once established, proves nearly impossible to erase. The Hashashin exist now in dual form: the historical sect whose fortresses and operations can be documented, and the mythic assassins of gardens and hashish, who serve as symbols for whatever fears or fascinations each era projects onto the distant and misunderstood past. But if the mythology is vast, what was the lived reality for those who became assassins? What did they believe, fear, and experience in the moments before they struck? A man who knows he will die tomorrow lives differently than one who expects to see old age. For the Fedayeen of the Nizari Ismaili state, this was not philosophy, but operational reality. From the moment an assassin received his assignment, accepted his blade, and began the long journey toward his target, he carried the weight of his own approaching death. The question was never whether he would survive, but whether he would succeed before the end came. What sustained him in those final weeks or months was not hope of escape, but something else entirely: the absolute certainty that his death had meaning, that it would be remembered, and that paradise waited on the other side of the blade. Religious conviction was the architecture of courage. A Fedayeen did not merely believe in God or the Imam. He believed with a specificity that left no room for doubt. Nizari Ismaili theology taught that the Imam was not just a spiritual leader, but the living proof of divine will on earth, the inheritor of sacred knowledge passed down from Ali through generations of hidden or persecuted leaders. To obey the Imam was to obey God directly. To die in service of the Imam was not suicide but martyrdom, a guaranteed passage to eternal reward. This was not vague comfort. but doctrinal certainty, reinforced through years of study, prayer, and communal life within the fortress walls. The Fedayeen memorized scripture, debated theology, and understood their place within a cosmic struggle between truth and tyranny. When the moment came to walk into a crowded courtyard with a dagger hidden beneath plain robes, that certainty did not waver. It was the ground beneath his feet. Yet certainty did not erase fear. The body still responded to danger. The heart still quickened as the target came into view. What religious training provided was not the absence of fear, but the framework to interpret it, to channel it, to move through it without hesitation. A Fedayeen understood that his fear was temporary, a test of faith, a final purification before eternal peace. He had rehearsed the moment countless times in his mind, the approach, the strike, the chaos that would follow. He knew he would not run. He knew he would not beg. He had made his peace with pain, with the swords and fists that would descend upon him, with the possibility of capture and the tortures that followed. His faith told him that suffering was brief, that angels watched, that his name would be spoken with reverence in Alamut. This was not delusion. It was the psychological architecture that allowed a young man to perform an act most human beings would find unthinkable. The isolation of deep cover work imposed its own psychological burden. A Fedayeen sent to infiltrate a rival court or Crusader city often lived there for months or years, posing as a merchant, a scribe, a servant, a mystic. He learned the local dialect until it was flawless. He memorized streets, routines, the rhythms of daily life. He attended prayers in mosques or churches depending on his cover. He made friends perhaps, or at least cultivated trust. Every conversation was performance. Every gesture was calculated. He could not confide in anyone, could not reveal his purpose, could not afford a single careless word. The loneliness was absolute. He lived surrounded by people who, if they knew his identity, would kill him slowly. He ate their bread, learned their children's names, and waited. The waiting itself became a form of torment. Months of feigned normalcy, of pretending to care about things that meant nothing, of suppressing every impulse that might betray his true allegiance. Some operatives went years without contact from Alamut, relying only on prior instruction and their own judgment. The psychological discipline required for this was extraordinary. It demanded the ability to live split in two, the surface self that smiled and nodded, and the inner self that remained loyal, vigilant, and utterly alone. Then came the moment itself. The target appeared. The crowd surged or thinned. The angle was right. The Fedayeen moved. His hand found the dagger. Time collapsed. Every sensory detail sharpened into brutal clarity. The texture of fabric beneath his fingers as he gripped the hilt, the smell of sweat and incense, the sound of voices nearby, the weight of the blade as it left its sheath. The target turned or did not turn. The Fedayeen closed the distance. 1 step, 2 steps. The blade went in. Resistance, then softness. The target's eyes widened. Mouth opened. Blood appeared, darker than expected, spreading fast. The Fedayeen did not pause to watch. He struck again if needed, driving the blade with mechanical precision. Shouts erupted. Hands grabbed at him. He did not resist. His work was finished. What followed was predetermined. Guards seized him, threw him to the ground. Fifths rained down. He felt ribs crack, tasted blood, heard his own breath coming in gasps. He did not cry out. He did not plead. His mind was already elsewhere, retreating into the certainty that had carried him this far. The pain was real, immediate, overwhelming, but it was also temporary. It would end, and then there would be peace. Capture meant interrogation, and interrogation meant torture. Medieval methods were designed not merely to extract information, but to break the will, to reduce a human being to begging animal. A captured Fedayeen could expect fire, blades, crushing devices, prolonged exposure. He could expect his fingers to be removed one by one, his skin flayed, his body subjected to agonies refined over centuries of judicial and military practice. Some broke, some revealed names, locations, networks, but many did not. Crusader chronicles and Islamic sources both record instances of Nizari operatives enduring days of torture. without betraying their comrades or renouncing their faith. This was not superhuman endurance. It was the product of psychological preparation so thorough that the body's suffering became secondary to the soul's purpose. A Fedayeen interrogated in a dungeon knew that his brothers in Alamet were praying for him, that his name was already being recorded in the annals of martyrs, that his suffering had meaning within a narrative larger than himself. This knowledge did not make the pain less. It made the pain bearable. The enduring question, asked by historians and moralists for centuries, is what these men truly were. Fanatics driven by delusion, victims manipulated by cynical leaders, true believers acting on unshakable conviction, pragmatists who chose martyrdom over a life of poverty and irrelevance? The answer, almost certainly, is that they were all of these and none of them in pure form. A young man raised in an Ismaili village, taught from childhood that his community was persecuted and righteous, who watched Seljuk soldiers burn homes and kill elders, who was offered purpose and eternal reward in exchange for his life. Was he manipulated or empowered? A Fedayeen who spent 2 years in Isfahan learning Persian poetry and the movements of the vizier's household, who became fluent in the language of power and recognized the systems that sustained his people's oppression, who chose the blade not in frenzy but in calculated conviction. Was he fanatical or rational? The categories collapse under scrutiny. What remains is the act itself, and the undeniable fact that these men did what they did with eyes open, aware of cost, convinced of necessity. The psychological reality of being a medieval assassin was not romantic. It was a combination of profound faith, systematic training, crushing isolation, and the acceptance of inevitable suffering. It required the ability to live for months or years in enemy territory without betraying oneself, to endure the corrosive loneliness of absolute secrecy, to strike with precision in a moment of chaos, and to face the consequences without flinching. It demanded a version of courage that had nothing to do with battlefield glory or knightly honor. It was the courage of the patient, the hidden, the willing sacrifice. Whether that courage was noble or monstrous depends entirely on perspective, on which side of the blade one stood, on whether one believed the cause justified the method. The Fedayeen themselves had no doubt. They knew what they were. They knew what they had chosen. And in the seconds before the strike, in the courtyard or the mosque or the narrow street, they were utterly, terribly certain. The fortresses are gone. The daggers are museum relics. But the act they perfected, targeted, symbolic, psychological murder, remains a tool of statecraft, resistance and terror to this day.